Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're diving into the world of flood maps. We've got a ton of research articles, policy documents, some really fascinating investigative journalism. You clearly did your homework for this one.
Yeah, it's a really interesting topic.
Our mission today is to really try to understand um, how are these maps even created? How did they actually impact communities? And, well, how do politics play a role in this whole process? There's got to be some politics involved.
Oh,
I
absolutely.
think there's a lot more to it than just, lines on a map. And to kind of kick things off, I want to share a statistic that I found pretty surprising. Um, so when Hurricane Harvey hit Houston back in 2017, nearly three-quarters of the homes that were damaged by a flood, and get this, they were actually outside the designated 100-year flood zone.
Wow.
I mean, that's a huge number of people who were caught completely off guard.
Yeah, it really highlights that, flood risk can extend far beyond those zones.
Yeah.
And, especially as we're seeing climate change kind of intensifying these weather patterns, leading to more frequent, more severe flooding events.
Yeah, climate change is the big elephant in the room
For sure.
for a lot of these conversations that we've been having recently. Okay, so let's kind of break this down a little bit. What exactly are these maps, and how are they actually created? I'm seeing this term firms pop up a lot in this research. What does that even stand for?
So FIRMS stands for Flood Insurance Rate Maps. And they're the official maps that are used by the National Flood Insurance Program, or NFIP.
Okay.
And as the name suggests, these maps are fundamentally tied to insurance. They determine which properties are required to have flood insurance, and they dictate how much those premiums will be.
Gotcha. So it's not just about, assessing the risk, it's also about setting insurance rates.
Precisely. And that connection to insurance is where things start to get really interesting and a bit controversial.
Ooh, I like controversial.
One of the, key criticisms of the NFIP is this concept of moral hazard.
Hmm.
And the idea is that when people have access to, subsidized flood insurance, they might be less likely to move away from these high-risk areas.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, if you know you're covered, the immediate financial risk it seems less daunting.
Exactly. But it's not just about the insurance itself. It's about this complex interplay of, emotions, finances, and perceptions of risk.
Right.
So people become attached to their homes, to their communities, and they might underestimate the real dangers. And plus, moving is a huge undertaking, both financially and emotionally.
Yeah. I mean, no one wants to leave their home. So it sounds like, human behavior plays a really big role in how we actually respond to these flood risks. Um, but if we dig a little deeper into the mechanics of these maps, how are they actually created?
So traditionally, they've been based on historical data. It's often referred to as stationary mapping. And it's kind of like trying to predict the future by only looking in the rearview mirror. We analyze past flood events to determine which areas are most likely to flood again in the future.
That's interesting. But wouldn't that approach be inherently flawed, especially with climate change kind of throwing a wrench into the predictability of these weather patterns?
That's a great point, and you're absolutely right. That's one of the major criticisms of just using historical data. Relying on those past trends might not accurately reflect the increasing frequency and severity of these floods, especially as a result of climate change.
Right, because climate change is changing those weather patterns.
Exactly.
So how do we move beyond that stationary approach and create maps that are more aligned with the reality of climate change?
That is the million-dollar question, and it's one that scientists and policymakers are really grappling with right now.
Yeah, it's a tough one.
It is. But one of the key strategies is to incorporate more sophisticated modeling techniques that actually take into account future climate projections. So things like sea level rise, changes in rainfall patterns.
So we need to start looking ahead, not just behind.
Exactly. It's about moving from simply mapping where it has flooded before to predicting where it's likely to flood in the future.
It's kind of like predictive modeling, but for floods.
Ex
Okay, so we've established that the creation of these flood maps is more than just drawing lines on a map. There's a lot of data, risk assessment, insurance considerations, and I'm sure a lot of political dynamics at play. But let's shift gears a bit and talk about the economic side of things. How do these maps impact property values and local economies?
Well, as you can imagine, being designated as a high-risk flood zone can have a significant impact on property values. When a property is labeled as high risk, it often triggers mandatory flood insurance, and that could be a substantial added expense for homeowners.
Right, and I'm guessing that expense can scare off potential buyers.
Absolutely. Many people are hesitant to buy a property that comes with the added cost of flood insurance. So demand for those properties can drop. And when demand falls, prices tend to follow. So that's where we start to see those ripple effects on local economies.
Yeah, in some cases, entire communities can see a decline in property values and economic activity as a result of these flood maps. And it can become really difficult to attract new residents and businesses, especially when neighboring areas are perceived as less risky.
That's a really good point. And I think it brings up another layer of complexity here, which is, the social and political dimensions of these maps. It's not just about dollars and cents. It's about how these designations affect people's lives and their sense of place.
Exactly. Flood maps aren't just technical documents, they have real social and political implications.
Right.
One of the most striking examples of this is the case of Syracuse, New York. Back in 2006, FEMA decided it was time to update the city's flood maps. They were woefully outdated.
Wow. So they were working with data that may not have reflected the current reality of the city's flood risk at all. Precisely. And when FEMA released its preliminary flood maps in 2008, they showed a dramatically expanded floodplain, particularly along Onondaga Creek, which flows through some of the city's most economically disadvantaged neighborhoods.
It's got to be tough. What were some of the major points of contention that kind of emerged from this process?
Well, residents in these neighborhoods were suddenly facing mandatory flood insurance requirements, which for many of them, it meant a substantial new expense they simply couldn't afford. They felt like they were being unfairly penalized, especially since many of them hadn't experienced any flooding in their lifetime.
So there was a sense of disconnect between the perception of risk on the ground and the data that was driving these new flood maps.
Exactly.
Right.
And this situation wasn't helped by the fact that the mapping process dragged on for years,
Oh, wow.
leading to a lot of uncertainty and anxiety for these residents. It took a full decade for the final maps to be adopted. And during that time, many people just felt left out of the loop.
A decade. That's a really long time to be living in this state of limbo, not knowing how these maps might ultimately affect your property and your finances.
Absolutely. It's a prime example of how, communication breakdowns and a lack of transparency can really exacerbate the already complex and emotionally charged issue of flood risk.
It sounds like even though the city ultimately negotiated a smaller floodplain than initially proposed, the process itself caused a lot of stress and mistrust.
It did. And it highlights the crucial need for open communication and community engagement when it comes to flood mapping and risk assessment. It's not just about drawing lines on a map, it's about understanding the real world implications of those lines and working with communities to develop solutions that are both equitable and effective.
That's such an important point. But let's zoom out a little bit and talk about those solutions. What are some of the most promising strategies that you're seeing out there for mitigating flood risk, especially as we grapple with the challenges of climate change?
One of the most promising areas of research is in developing more dynamic flood maps, ones that go beyond simply relying on this historical data.
So kind of moving away from that, looking in the rearview mirror approach that we talked about earlier.
Exactly. These new mapping techniques incorporate real-time data, like rainfall intensity, river levels, even soil moisture, to provide a more accurate and up-to-the-minute assessment of flood risk.
That sounds incredibly sophisticated. But I imagine collecting and analyzing that much data presents its own set of challenges.
Of course, of course. These advanced mapping techniques require robust data collection networks, powerful computing capabilities, and sophisticated modeling algorithms. But as technology continues to advance, these approaches are becoming increasingly accessible and affordable.
That's good. That's good to hear. But even with the best maps and data in the world, we still need to have those difficult conversations about adaptation and resilience.
Absolutely. Maps can provide crucial information, but they can't make decisions for us. We need to be proactive in thinking about how we design our communities, how we manage our water resources, and how we prepare for the inevitable changes that are coming our way.
Okay, so we've talked about the science behind these flood maps, the political and economic implications, the need for better communication and community engagement. What about the human element here? What are some of the psychological factors that might influence how people perceive and respond to flood risk?
That's a fascinating question, and it's one that's often overlooked. One of the key factors is something called optimism bias, which is our tendency to underestimate the likelihood that bad things will happen to us.
Interesting.
So this can lead people to, downplay the risks of flooding, even if they live in a high-risk area.
Right, so it's kind of like that "it won't happen to me" mentality.
Exactly. There's also a phenomenon known as place attachment, which refers to the emotional bond we develop with our homes and communities. And this can make it very difficult for people to even consider moving, even if it's the most logical choice from a risk management perspective.
I can totally relate to that. I mean, our homes are more than just structures. They hold our memories, our sense of belonging, our sense of security.
Precisely. And that's why it's so crucial to approach flood risk communication with empathy and understanding. It's not about simply telling people what to do, it's about working with them to identify solutions that are both practical and emotionally resonant.
It sounds like we need to find ways to kind of bridge that gap between the technical data and the human experience
Yeah.
to make flood risk feel more tangible and relatable to people.
That's exactly right. And one way to do that is to focus on storytelling.
Oh, interesting.
Hearing personal accounts of flood experiences can make the risk feel much more real and immediate. And it can help people connect with the emotional and financial toll that flooding can take.
Stories have the power to like cut through the jargon and the statistics and make these issues feel more personal and relevant.
Absolutely. And they can also help to build a sense of community and shared responsibility, which is essential for developing effective adaptation and resilience strategies.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. From the technical aspects of flood mapping to the psychological barriers that can hinder effective communication and adaptation. But let's shift gears one more time and talk about some of the broader policy implications of all of this.
Sure. One of the key policy challenges is finding ways to incentivize risk reduction and resilience, rather than simply reacting to disasters after they occur.
Right, so moving from a reactive approach to a more proactive one.
Exactly. This could involve things like providing financial incentives for homeowners to elevate their homes or relocate to safer areas, investing in green infrastructure to absorb floodwaters, updating building codes to make new construction more resilient to flooding.
But I imagine those types of policies can be really costly and politically challenging to implement.
That's true. At the cost of inaction are far greater in the long run. Every dollar spent on mitigation saves an average of $6 in disaster recovery costs. And beyond the financial considerations, there's the immeasurable human cost of loss, displacement, and trauma that comes with flooding.
It sounds like we need to start thinking about flood risk, not just as an environmental issue, but as a social, economic, and public health issue as well.
Absolutely. Flood risk is a complex, multifaceted problem, and it requires a holistic, integrated approach to find solutions. We need to break down the silos between government agencies, scientists, engineers, community leaders, and residents, and work together to create a more resilient future for all.
Well, that's a great point to end on. We spent this deep dive really exploring the intricate world of flood maps. We delved into the science, the politics, and the human impact. And it's become pretty clear that we need a major shift in how we think about and address flood risk, especially in the face of a changing climate.
Yeah, I agree. We can't afford to just rely on past data and outdated models. We need to embrace these innovative mapping techniques, improve communication, and foster more community engagement.
Yeah, and most importantly, we need to acknowledge that flood risk is not just an environmental issue. It's an issue of equity, resilience, and the long-term well-being of our communities. And we really hope that this deep dive has sparked your curiosity and empowered you to maybe learn a little bit more about flood risk in your own community. Remember, knowledge is power. And the more we understand about the challenges that we face, the better equipped we'll be to actually find solutions.
Well said.
So thank you so much for joining us on the deep dive. We encourage you to keep exploring, keep learning, and keep diving deep. We'll see you next time. It feels like, we've only just scratched the surface of this incredibly complex topic. But before we wrap things up, I want to kind of bring it back to you, the listener. What can we as individuals do to contribute to a more resilient future?
That's a great question. And there are actually many things you can do. First and foremost, I encourage everyone to just become familiar with the flood risks in their own communities. Go beyond just checking whether your property falls within a designated flood zone. Think about the bigger picture, right? The waterways, the infrastructure, and how those systems might be impacted by climate change.
So it's about being aware of our surroundings and understanding how interconnected everything really is.
Exactly. What happens upstream will impact those downstream and vice versa. We need to remember we're all in this together and work collaboratively to find solutions. So, get involved in local planning initiatives, advocate for policies that prioritize risk reduction and resilience, and support organizations that are working toward a more sustainable future.
It's about being proactive rather than reactive, not just responding to disasters after they occur, but taking steps to mitigate the impact before they even happen.
Absolutely. And don't forget, it's not just about protecting property, it's about protecting lives, livelihoods, and the social fabric of our communities.
I think that's a really important message to underscore here. This deep dive has been, honestly, incredibly eye-opening. We've learned about the science, the politics, and the very real human impact of flood mapping.
Yeah, we've seen how these maps are created, how they can affect property values, local economies, and just how important it is to approach this issue with, a more forward-thinking, holistic perspective.
We need a major shift in how we think about and address flood risk, especially as the climate continues to change. We can't just keep relying on past data and outdated models.
We need to embrace innovative mapping techniques, improve communication and community engagement, and just prioritize, equitable solutions that benefit everyone, not just those with the most resources.
We really hope this deep dive has, sparked your curiosity and empowered you to learn more about flood risk in your own communities. Remember, knowledge is power. And the more we understand about these challenges, the better equipped we are to find solutions.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for joining us on the deep dive. We encourage you to keep exploring, keep learning, and keep diving deep. We'll catch you in the next one.